Okay, that was mildly embarrassing, but we are back now without our technical difficulties, so let us continue with our bedtime story. Well, technically it isn't bedtime, but you know what? It's bedtime somewhere in the world, right? Actually, we have now a interestingly borderline fanatic Japanese contingent for whom this is technically a bedtime story. So I hope you enjoy. Oyasumi nasai. Actually, no, I should say that afterwards. We continue with the English Constitution as written by Walter Bagehot in the book that I sent out on page 34. The second paragraph, or rather the third paragraph. Philosophers may deride this superstition, but its results are inestimable. By the spectacle of this august society, countless ignorant men and women are induced to obey the few nominal electors, the £10 borough renters, and the £50 county renters, who have nothing imposing about them, nothing which would attract the eye or fascinate the fancy. What impresses men is not mind, but the result of mind. And the greatest of these results is this wonderful spectacle of society, which is ever new and yet ever the same, in which accidents pass and essence remains, in which one generation dies and another succeeds, as if they were birds in a cage or animals in a menagerie, of which it seems almost more than a metaphor to treat the parts as limbs of a perpetual living thing. So silently do they seem to change, so wonderfully and so perfectly does the conspicuous life of the new year take the place of the conspicuous life of the last year. The apparent rulers of the English nation are like the most imposing personages of a splendid procession. It is by them the mob are influenced. It is they whom the spectators cheer. The real rulers are secreted in second-rate carriages. No one cares for them or asks about them, but they are obeyed implicitly and unconsciously by reason of the splendor of those who eclipsed and preceded them. It is quite true that this imaginative sentiment is supported by a sensation of political satisfaction. It cannot be said that the mass of the English people are well off. There are whole classes who have not a conception of what the higher order call comfort, who have not the prerequisite of moral existence, who cannot lead the life that becomes a man. But the most miserable of these classes do not impute their misery to politics. If a political agitator were to lecture to the peasants of Dorsetshire and try to excite political dissatisfaction, it is much more likely that he would be pelted than that he would succeed. Of Parliament, these miserable creatures know scarcely anything. Of the cabinet they never heard. But they would say that, for all they have heard, the Queen is very good. And rebelling against the structure of society is to their minds rebelling against the Queen, who rules that society, in whom all its most impressive part, the part that they know, culminates. The mass of the English people are politically contented as well as politically differential. A differential community, even though its lowest classes are not intelligent, is far more suited to a cabinet government than any kind of democratic country, because it is more suited to political excellence. The highest classes can rule it, and the highest classes must, as such, have more political ability than the lower classes. A life of labor, an incomplete education, a monotonous occupation, a career in which the hands are used much and the judgment is used little, cannot create as much flexible thought, as much applicable intelligence as a life of leisure, a long culture, a varied experience, an existence by which the judgment is incessantly exercised, and by which it may be incessantly improved. A country of respectful poor, though far less happy than where there are no poor to be respectful, is nevertheless far more fitted for the best government. You can use the best classes of the respectful country. You can only use the worst where every man thinks he is as good as every other. Can I just repeat that last part again? You can use the best classes of the respectful country. You can only use the worst where every man thinks he is as good as every other. Right? You can only use the worst classes in your political system if your country in your country every man thinks he is as good as every other. I'm just gonna let that sit there for a little bit. It is evident that no difficulty can be greater than that of founding a deferential nation. Respect is traditional. It is not given not to what is proved to be good, but to what is known to be old. Certain classes in certain nations retain by common acceptance a marked political preference because they have always possessed it, and because they inherit a sort of pomp which seems to make them worthy of it. But in a new colony, in a community where merit may be equal, and where there cannot be traditional marks of merit and fitness, it is obvious that a political deference can be yielded to higher culture only upon proof, first of its existence, and next of its political value. But it is nearly impossible to give such a proof so as to satisfy persons of less culture. In a future and better age of the world, it may be effected, but in this age the requisite premise scarcely exists. If the discussion be effectually open, if the debate be fairly begun, it is hardly possible to obtain a rational and argumentative acquiescence in the rule of the cultivated few. As yet the few rule by their hold, not over the reason of the multitude, but over their imaginations and their habits, over their fancies as to distant things they do not know at all, over their customs as to near things which they know very well. Let me just note this down so that we can talk about it, because I have seen a couple of our year 1 class students ask about this. Page 36. Classes ruling where every man thinks. Yeah, we will discuss this in our next philosophy stream. I don't think we have one this week, but we will have one. I'm sure someone will sponsor one of them sooner or later. A differential community in which the bulk of the people are ignorant is therefore in a state of what is called in mechanics unstable equilibrium. If the equilibrium is once disturbed, there is no tendency to return to it, but rather to depart from it. A cone balanced on its point is in unstable equilibrium, for if you push it ever so little, it will depart farther and farther from its position and fall to the earth. So in communities where the masses are ignorant but respectful. If you once permit the ignorant class to begin to rule, you may bid for a farewell to deference forever. Their demagogues will inculcate, their newspapers will recount that the rule of the existing dynasty, the people, is better than the rule of the fallen dynasty, the aristocracy. A people very rarely hears two sides of a subject in which it is much interested. The popular organs take up the side which is acceptable, and none but the popular organs in fact reach the people. A people never hears censure of itself. No one will tell it that the educated minority whom it dethroned governed better or more wisely than it governs. A democracy will never, save after an awful catastrophe, return what has once been conceded to it, for to do so would be to admit an inferiority in itself, of which, except by some almost unbearable misfortune, it could never be convinced. Can we just point out, I just want to point this out, that you can see the analogs from what Bagehot is saying. Presage the class struggle, communism, and fascism in the early 20s. Right? So, really, all of these things kind of derive from that, and from what Bagehot is talking about the will of the classes, right? It's fascinating stuff to me personally. Now, chapter 3, and this is page 38. The use of the Queen, and this is Queen Victoria, by the way, not Queen Elizabeth II. The use of the Queen in a dignified capacity is incalculable. Without her in England, the present English government would fail and pass away. Most people, when they read that the Queen walked on the slopes at Windsor, that the Prince of Wales went to the Derby, have imagined that too much thought and prominence were given to little things. But they have been in error, and is it nice to trace how the actions of a retired widow and an unemployed youth become of such importance? The best reason why monarchy is a strong government is that it is an intelligible government. The mass of mankind understand it, and they hardly anywhere in the world understand any other. It is often said that men are ruled by their imaginations, but it would be truer to say that they are governed by the weakness of their imaginations. The nature of a constitution, the action of an assembly, the play of parties, the unseen formation of a guiding opinion are complex facts, difficult to know and easy to mistake. But the action of a single will, the fiat of a single mind, are easy ideas. Anybody can make them out, and no one can ever forget them. When you put before the mass of mankind the question, will you be governed by a king or will you be governed by a constitution? The inquiry comes out thus: will you be governed in a way you understand, or will you be governed in a way that you do not understand? The issue was put to the French people. They were asked, will you be governed by Louis Napoleon, or will you be governed by an assembly? The French people said, we will be governed by the one man we can imagine, not by the many people we cannot imagine. Obviously, Emperor Napoleon III also drew on the fame and prestige of my boy Bonaparte, right? And that is a whole other issue that we can explore in the future. The best mode of comprehending the nature of the two governments is to look at a country in which the two have, within a comparatively short space of years, succeeded each other. The political condition, says Mr. Grote, which Grecian legend everywhere presents to us, is in its principal features strikingly different from that which have become universally prevalent among the Greeks in the time of the Peloponnesian War. Historical oligarchy, as well as democracy, agreed in requiring a certain established system of government comprising the three elements of specialized functions, temporary functionaries, and ultimate responsibility, under some forms or other, to the mass of qualified citizens, either a senate or an ecclesia or both. There were, of course, many and capital distinctions between one government and another, in respect to the qualifications of the citizen, the attributes and efficiency of the General Assembly, the admissibility of power, etc. And men might often be dissatisfied with the way in which these questions were determined in their own city. But in the mind of every man, some determining rule or system, something like what in modern times is called a constitution, was indispensable to any government entitled to be called legitimate or capable of creating in the mind of a Greek a feeling of moral obligation to obey it. The functionaries who exercised authority under it might be more or less competent or popular, but his personal feelings towards them were commonly lost in his attachment or aversion to the general system. If an energetic man could, by audacity or craft, break down the constitution and render himself permanent ruler according to his own will and pleasure, even though he might govern well, he could never inspire the people with any sentiment or duty towards him. His scepter was illegitimate from the beginning, and even the taking of his life, far from being interdicted by the moral feeling which condemned the shedding of blood in other cases, was considered meritorious. He could not even be mentioned in the language except by name despot. I'm not going to try the Greek because I have no ability to speak Greek. Let me just refresh my face as was demanded. There we go. Which branded him as an object of mingled fear and dislike. If we carry our eyes back from historical to legendary Greeks, we find a picture the reverse of what has been here sketched. We discern a government in which there is little or no scheme or system, still less any idea of responsibility to the governed, but in which the mainspring of obedience on the part of the people consists in their personal feeling and reverence towards the chief. We remark, first and foremost, the king. Next, a limited number of subordinate kings or chiefs. Afterwards, the mass of armed freemen, husbandmen, artisans, freebooters, etc. Lowest of all, the free laborers for hire and the bought slaves. The king is not distinguished by any broad or impassable boundary from the other chiefs, to each of whom the title Basileus is applicable as well as to himself. His supremacy has been inherited from his ancestors and passes by inheritance as a general rule to his eldest son, having been conferred upon the family as a privilege by the favor of Zeus. In war, he is the leader, foremost in personal prowess and directing all military movements. In peace, he is the general protector of the injured and oppressed. He offers up, moreover, those public prayers and sacrifices which are intended to obtain for the whole people the favor of the gods. An ample domain is assigned to him as an appurtenance of his lofty position, and the produce of his fields and his cattle is consecrated in part to an abundant, though rude, hospitality. Moreover, he receives frequent presents to avert his enmity, to conciliate his favor, or to buy off his exactions. When the plunder is taken from an enemy, a large previous share, comprising probably the most alluring female captive, is reserved for him apart from the general distribution. Such is the position of the king in the heroic times of Greece, the only person, if we accept the heralds and priests, each both special and subordinate, who is then presented to us as clothed with any individual authority, the person by whom all the executive functions, then few in number, which the society requires, are either performed or directed. His personal ascendancy derived from the divine countenance bestowed upon him individually and upon his race, and probably from accredited divine descent, is the salient feature in the picture. The people hearken to his voice, embrace his propositions, and obey his orders. Not merely resistance, but even criticism upon his acts is generally exhibited in an odious point of view, and is indeed never heard of, except from some one or more of the subordinate princes. Also, hi Locking. We are just in the middle of reading a bedtime story. Well, it's not really a bedtime story, but blame the folk in the Discord for that. The characteristic of the English monarchy is that it retains the feelings by which the heroic kings governed the rude age, and has added the feelings by which the constitutions of later Greece ruled in more refined ages. We are a more mixed people than the Athenians, or probably than any political Greeks. We have progressed more unequally. The slaves in ancient times were a separate order, not ruled by the same laws or thoughts as other men. It was not necessary to think of them in making a constitution. it was not necessary to improve them in order to make a constitution possible. The Greek legislator had not to combine in his polity men like the laborers of Somersetshire and men like Mr. Grote. He had not to deal with a community in which primitive barbarism lay as a recognized basis to acquired civilization. We have no slaves to keep down by special terrors and independent legislation, but we have whole classes unable to comprehend the idea of a constitution, unable to feel the least attachment to impersonal laws. Most do indeed vaguely know that there are some other institutions besides the Queen, and some rules by which she governs. But a vast number like their minds to dwell more upon her than on anything else, and therefore she is inestimable. A republic has only difficult ideas in government. A constitutional monarchy has an easy idea too. It has a comprehensible element for the vacant many, as well as complex laws and notions for the inquiring few. A family on the throne. Oh wait, no, we're not out of time. A family on the throne is an interesting idea also. It brings down the pride of sovereignty to the level of petty life. No feeling could seem more childish than the enthusiasm of the English at the marriage of the Prince of Wales. They treated as a great political event what, looked at as a matter of pure business, was very small indeed. But no feeling could be more common human nature as it is, and as it is likely to be. The women, one half the human race at least, care 50 times more for the marriage than a ministry. All but a few cynics like to see a pretty novel touching for a moment the dry scenes of the grave world. A princely marriage is the brilliant edition of a universal fact, and as such it rivets mankind. We smile at the court circular, but remember how many people read the court circular. Its use is not in what it says, but in those to whom it speaks. They say that the Americans were more pleased at the Queen's letter to Mrs. Lincoln than at any act of the English government. It was a spontaneous act of intelligible feeling in the midst of confused and tiresome business. Just so a royal family sweetens politics by the seasonable addition of nice and pretty events, it introduces irrelevant facts into the business of government. But they are facts which speak to men's bosoms and employ their thoughts. To state the matter shortly, royalty is a government in which the attention of the nation is concentrated on one person doing interesting actions. A republic is a government in which that attention is divided between many, who are all doing uninteresting actions. Accordingly, so long as the human heart is strong and the human reason weak, royalty will be strong because it appeals to diffused feelings, and republics weak because they appeal to understanding. Let's take a moment. Let me add this into what we're going to discuss. As long as human heart is strong and reason weak, monarchy. Does that say monarchy? Royalty will be strong. So, as the Year 1 Class 2 Corporation has made its desire to talk about this next week very clear, we'll talk about this part as well. Secondly, the English monarchy strengthens our government with the strength of religion. It is not easy to say why it should be so. Every instructed theologian would say that it was the duty of a person born under a republic as much to obey that republic as it is the duty of one born under a monarchy to obey the monarch. But the mass of the English people do not think so. They agree with the oath of allegiance, they say it is their duty to obey the Queen, and they have but hazy notions as to obeying laws without a Queen. In former times, when our constitution was incomplete, this notion of local holiness in one part was mischievous. All parts were struggling, and it was necessary each should have its full growth. But superstition said one should grow where it would, and no other part should grow without its leave. The whole Cavalier party said it was their duty to obey the king, whatever the king did. There was to be passive obedience to him, and there was no religious obedience due to anyone else. He was the Lord's anointed, and no one else had been anointed at all. The parliament, the laws, the press were human institutions, but the monarchy was a divine institution. An undue advantage was given to a part of the constitution, and therefore the progress of the whole was stayed. After the revolution, this mischievous sentiment was much weaker. The change of the line of sovereigns was at first conclusive. If there were mystic right in anyone, that right was plainly in James II. If it was an English duty to obey anyone, oh, my face died. If there was an English duty to obey anyone, whatever he did, he was the person to be so obeyed, James II does. If there was an inherited claim in any king, it was in the Stuart king to whom the crown had come by descent, and not in the Revolution king to whom it had come by vote of Parliament. William III, by the way, just so we're clear on that. I am Locking. I am actually reading this from a book written in when was this written? 1840 something, by Walter Bagehot, and it is the foundation by which the English government was run for, I think, about 100 years, up until, give or take, after the Second World War, when Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne. Elizabeth II. Where are we? Right. Blah, blah, blah. Right. All through the reign of William III, there was, in common speech, one king whom man had made, and another king whom God had made. The king who ruled had no consecrated loyalty to build upon, although he ruled in fact. According to a sacred theory, there was a king in France who ought to rule. But it was very hard for the English people, with their plain sense and slow imagination, to keep up a strong sentiment of veneration for a foreign adventurer. He lived under the protection of a French king. What he did was commonly stupid, and what he left undone was very often wise. As soon as Queen Anne began to reign, there was a change of feeling. The old sacred sentiment began to cohere about her. There were indeed difficulties which would have baffled most people, but an Englishman whose heart is in the matter is not easily baffled. Queen Anne had a brother living and a father living, and by every rule of descent, their right was better than hers. But many people evaded both claims. They said James II had run away, and so abdicated, though he only ran away because he was in duress and was frightened, and though he claimed the allegiance of his subjects day by day. The pretender, it was said, was not legitimate, though the birth was proved by evidence which any court of justice would have accepted. The English people were out of a sacred monarch, and so they tried very hard to make a new one. Events, however, were too strong for them. They were ready and eager to take Queen Anne as the stock of a new dynasty. They were ready to ignore the claims of her father and the claims of her brother, but they could not ignore the fact that at the critical period she had no children. She had once had 13, but they all died in her lifetime, and it was necessary either to revert to the Stuarts or to make a new king by Act of Parliament. According to the Act of Settlement passed by the Whigs, the crown was settled on the descendants of the Princess Sophia of Hanover, a younger daughter of a daughter of James I. There were before her James II, his son, the descendants of a daughter of Charles I, and elder children of her own mother. But the Whigs passed these over because they were Catholics, and selected the Princess Sophia, who if she was anything, was a Protestant. Certainly, this selection was statesmanlike, but it could not be very popular. It was quite impossible to say that it was the duty of the English people to obey the House of Hanover upon any principles which do not concede the right of the people to choose their rulers, and which do not degrade monarchy from its solitary pinnacle of majestic reverence and make it one only among many expedient institutions. If a king is a useful public functionary who may be changed, and in whose place you may make another, you cannot regard him with mystic awe or wonder. And if you are bound to worship him, of course you cannot change him. Accordingly, during the whole reigns of George I and George II, the sentiment of religious loyalty altogether ceased to support the crown. The prerogative of the king had no strong party to support it. The Tories, who naturally would support it, disliked the actual king, and the Whigs, according to their creed, disliked the king's office. Until the accession of George III, the most vigorous opponents of the crown were the country gentlemen, its natural friends, and the representatives of quiet rural districts, where loyalty is mostly to be found, if anywhere. But after the accession of George III, the common feeling came back to the same point as in Queen Anne's time. The English were ready to take the new young prince as the beginning of a sacred line of sovereigns, just as they had been willing to take an old lady who was the second cousin of his great-great-grandmother. So it is now. If you ask the immense majority of the Queen's subjects by what right she rules, they would never tell you that she rules by parliamentary right, by virtue of 6 and circa 7. They will say that she rules by God's grace. They believe that they have a mystic obligation to obey her. When her family came to the crown, it was a sort of treason to maintain the inalienable right of lineal sovereignty, for it was equivalent to saying that the claim of another family was better than hers. But now, in the strange course of human events, that very sentiment has become her surest and best support. Oh, this is definitely more difficult for me to read than Lombard Street. But we have reached our limit for today, so I will say this. Thank you very much for watching. In conclusion, please download Firefox, please don't do Chrome, and we shall continue tomorrow. And to answer the question of our Year 1 Class 2 corporation, yes, I will make it a point to insert the philosophy discussions for next week, where we will be talking about the nature of classes and the nature of ruling, and sort of the quote, as long as human heart is strong and reason weak, royalty will be strong. And we have many modern examples to draw upon for that, right? Excellent. Now, wait, I'm done. Yes. I do apologize to those of us in Asia who actually wanted to listen to this as a bedtime story. It never ends up working out that way. But I will say, oyasumi nasai, and also left eye, wink.